So this is the multi-tenancy working group meeting for Tuesday, January 29th. Last week's meeting, we went over a working group proposal that included a project plan, definitions of soft and hard multi-tenancy, and proposed work around multiple phases of defining and implementing soft multi-tenancy and then also hard multi-tenancy. So for today's meeting, on the agenda, we had a suggestion that we go over basically the project plan for that and start seeing if people want to start picking up and formalizing some of the work there as next steps. There wasn't a ton of feedback on the document. I assume we'll get more over time. So I'll just share out what I'm looking at right now. So this is the Kubernetes multi-tenancy working group plan. I will put the link in chat. And then you can also find this by going to the agenda for this group, which is right here, and the link is right there. And it's also been sent out on the mailing list. So we went over all of this content at the last meeting. And the next steps that we're looking at doing is moving this information formally into a working group architecture framework document accessible via our wiki page, and then documenting mode S1 exactly and completely in this document. That initial focus would be only for on-prem multi-tenant Kubernetes cluster and a limited focus on the services and default namespace. Does anyone want to talk more about this? Okay, let's see what we got. So specifically what we're looking at for next steps and timelines is we're looking at the working group as a group kind of coming together and agreeing that this is the direction we want to start pushing in. And then we're going to start working on publishing the soft multi-tenancy S1 model and functional definition. So as we work towards doing that, we have a bunch of documentation in here that kind of has some good kicking off points and going over what the multi-tenancy model for S1 is. And this was all gone over in some depth at the last meeting. But I just kind of like to open it up to this group as far as looking at this path. Do we have any thoughts about changing immediate direction? Have people kind of taken the time to go over this? Are there any initial reactions to this that you would like to kind of talk about right now? Or are people just kind of ready to start formalizing this in that architecture diagram? And should we kind of take it as the next steps to kick off that diagram and document and start kind of going from there?
So I guess, I had one quick question about that last slide you showed with the tenants and the namespacing for clarification. Is it any namespace that is not a default kube system or kube public? Is that a tenant, or are we defining? So are we defining any namespace outside of those three as a tenant and that are segregated, or is it optional to be a tenant?
Yeah,
I think. Sorry.
I can comment on that, and I think if somebody wants to add, that's fine too. So the thought at this point, so firstly, this is a straw man, right? So we want to provide a reference, but we don't want to be overly prescriptive, right? So we are welcoming what everybody feels in terms of how much to prescribe and how much not to prescribe. So this is an candidate reference model where we use the default namespace that we've got some shared monitoring service, shared ingress service, and so on. And then we have the kube system and kube public, and then every other namespace is a tenant. Now, as I have mentioned in the notes below, There is a possibility that sooner or later we would need multiple services namespaces, because maybe you want to shard the shared services. For example, shared service 1 is only for tenants A and B, and shared service 2 of the same type is only for tenants C and D, and perhaps you do not want to put them in the same namespace for additional isolation purposes. So the thought was that we would create a reference model using this to start with. By no means this would be the end. We could always iterate and modify it. But so far, this was the thought as a starting point. So the thought was, let's get it fully defined, decide what kind of, how much of it we want to be capturing into like the Kubernetes conformance testing automation. Keep in mind, this will not be, meaning it will be a kind of a optional component of Kubernetes conformance, right? So I'm using the word conformance in a little bit loose sense here. So once we've gone through that, the thought is kind of make it agile and keep on iterating over time. And then we could, so it's going to be a bit of a dynamic process. We'll try to put something together that works, and then we can it's not meant to be exclusive or closed-ended. We could have additional models as well.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Did that help?
Yeah. I mean, I guess I'm just thinking, right? So there's so many other like third-party services out there that they default to creating their own namespace. And a lot of them are shared, like Istio, for example. And so pushing those all into one single namespace for shared could get tricky. And so that's why I was kind of just seeing what your thoughts were around that.
Right.
It seems to me big from the slide before, like, because I think we've agreed that there's not a one-to-one from tenants to namespaces, and tenants can have multiple namespaces. So we already have to maintain somewhere a mapping between tenants and namespaces. It's just one more extra line in that mapping. So to go, where is this tenant's shared services namespace, and it defaults to default in the beginning.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And also, to keep things simple, we would start with the one-to-one mapping model, meaning one tenant to one namespace. But as we've noted here, it's on the cards to have n namespaces to one tenant.
So can you explain slide 7 then, if it's one-to-one?
So slide 7 here is showing 3 worker nodes on the left and 3 master nodes and 4 worker nodes. Okay.
Oh, they're nodes. Okay.
These are nodes. Yeah. So these are
namespace.
Right. I should have probably tagged them better. So these are 4 worker nodes, and here the 3 colored bars are 3 namespaces and also 3 tenants, A, B, and C. And the dotted line, the dotted square below, is one of the system namespaces like Cube System, which in potential could run across all of these nodes, or the default namespace. So there may be a requirement that the namespaces of some tenants be restricted to certain nodes. For example, the blue tenant A is restricted only the top right, the 2 right worker nodes, whereas tenant B can use all worker nodes. So that's kind of the model here.
So is the suggestion to add into the RBAC model nodes as well as namespaces?
So there's been some discussion in the past that some tenants may want isolation by exclusive use of nodes. So tenant B in this picture wants to be the exclusive tenant using those 2 worker nodes.
I get that. But so how, other than including nodes into the RBAC model, how else would you implement this?
Yes. So a combination of RBAC and the node taints and so on.
Right. So I think my immediate reaction to that is insisting that everybody has the right, all the nodes have the right taints and all of the tenant workloads have the right tolerations. If you're not going to put something, you're going to have like a broker API or a forced mutating admission controller, that gets pretty complicated. Whereas if you could actually add the nodes into the RBAC model, it would just naturally fall out. It would be just part of the RBAC definition and not rely on anything happening on the workload side.
Sure. I mean, this was supposed to be an initial framework draft. So as we
I was just wondering what you were thinking.
Yeah, this is the high level thinking. We welcome everyone's collective input and we can continue iterating.
I added a comment, but one thing that I had an opinion on was for maybe slide 9, just that if you're getting started, if you use Docker shim, you're going to have a harder time being able to migrate to use alternative runtime engines. If you use something like Cryo or Containerd, it's very simple for people to just plug in a lot of other OCI compliant runtimes.
Can you repeat your comment? You said starting with regular Docker.
I wouldn't start with Docker shim if I was getting started. I would use a more flexible CRI implementation, something like Containerd or Cryo. And the reason I say that is because if you want to use something like Kata, that's going to be step 1, is doing that. And to modify a cluster that already has Cryo or Containerd is very easy. You can just run a daemon set, and then you can go on and be using alternative runtimes on each node. If you start with Docker shim, step 1 will be to remove Docker shim and then put in something that's a little more flexible.
Okay, so I hear you, but here's kind of the thought process here. Mm-hmm. So what we are calling Model S1 is supposed to be something that can be immediately useful to most people today without requiring new functionality or runtimes that are not yet commonly used. So since the common is Docker, regular Docker runtime, the emphasis with Model S1 is to go with sort of common topologies that are used today, and then have maybe a Model S2, which is sort of newer runtimes and other newer features. I mean, that's the thought so far. If you think there's pros and cons, we could, there's some amount of flexibility in how to do this. But Model S1 was supposed to be common configurations using today's constructs. That was sort of the theme behind Model S1. I
guess I'm not sure, and maybe other people have more experience on relative production use and support. I know a lot of people are using Containerd and Cryo as well. I agree. Like I wouldn't go in here and say like y'all should use Kata runtime right now. That doesn't make any sense, especially for S1. But I'm saying if you start with S1, the gap between S1 and S2, if you use a runtime that it has some flexibility, a CRI implementation, that has some flexibility, it'll be a lot easier for people to move from S1 to S2 or to live somewhere in between.
Okay.
And I think to add to that, isn't Containerd the default starting in 13 or 14? Proposed or already implemented? I know Containerd is going to be the default soon, so maybe that is something that we just reevaluate, and that's what we target for S1 is this version of Kate's or above, and then.
Sure, point taken. We'll look at whether Containerd is imminently becoming the default, and Eric's point about maybe considering that.
Cool. Thanks.
And again, we would welcome your expertise on all of this because these are very broad topics, right? So all of us have a certain perspective, but really we need to collectively pool our inputs to make this work, because this is so many broad collection of topics here that we are not necessarily up to date on the exact status of, let's say, Containerd, default, and so on.
Doesn't slow down and allow us to catch up. It just keeps running. I know.
Yeah. So that's why we have to be a little bit iterative. We want to kind of just get something working with a certain configuration, and then we'll have to do more iterations as the community progresses. One question I had for everyone attending here and anyone else that you think might have an input is, so the thought so far was that we would create a reference model, look at adding some kind of conformance testing, right, in Kubernetes upstream testing as maybe as a special test suite, like in bullet item 3 it says third party test suite, and then maybe get input from at that point, or maybe a little bit earlier than that, kind of get input from sig-auth as to whether this is in line with their thinking of where multi-tenancy ought to go. And in parallel be then developing new controllers for these to enforce these profiles. Does that and then does that sound about the right approach to everyone? Anyone have a drastically different sort of suggestion?
So we need to I was supposed to do this and I forgot, but get some guidance on what the on conformance and how and whether this can be integrated into conformance. So Yisui and I had a discussion like this, I think I mentioned a couple months ago with Brian Grant many months ago, like maybe 6 months ago. And there were some reasons why it didn't seem like these kinds of security levels, or whatever you want to call them, isolation levels, were a good match for conformance. And so we kind of dropped that idea. So I'm pretty sure I told Tasha, and then never did it, that I would get Brian to write something up on like kind of what are the guidelines for Kubernetes conformance and how it works, and then we could go from there to figure out how to integrate this. Because there were some unusual rules there that I hadn't expected about conformance tests that made it difficult to work this idea into conformance. I no longer remember most of the details. Like the only detail I remember was like you can't use RBAC in conformance tests, from what I recall. And so like I need to get that written down, get him to write that down, or someone else from the conformance working group kind of write down the guidelines, so that then we can make a decision about how and whether we could do that. So that would be my comments on that piece. And yeah, on the controller to enforce it, I mean, I think that kind of aligns pretty well with the security profiles stuff that Yisui is talking about in the past, for like configuring a cluster with the right command line flags and policy objects for a particular policy. So that might be a good candidate to consider as a starting point if we decide we want some kind of controllers to enforce this. But obviously getting the different policies written down or levels or whatever first is the first step. But yeah. That's
so
all.
David, agreed. I'll just add a comment to each of your 2 points. On the first point, we did talk to Srinivas, who's one of the conformance testing maintainers and leads, and he was on the call last time, and I also had a private chat with him as well. And yes, he did mention that you don't want to make it part of the official conformance testing, because that will run into the challenges similar to what you were indicating. And that's why the word we are using is third-party test suite, right? In bullet 3, you're not calling it Kubernetes performance testing, Kubernetes conformance testing. It is just an ad hoc test suite that we initially provide just in case somebody wants to test their cluster to be conformant with one of these reference model. Here's an ad hoc test suite. It's not necessarily part of the official Kubernetes upstream initially. Once we get more mindshare within sig-auth or whatever, or conformance group, we could go there. But at least initially, we could just do sort of a third-party test suite.
Okay, got it. Sorry, I unfortunately missed the last the last multi-tenancy working group meeting, so I didn't watch the video yet, so I missed that, and I didn't notice that on the slide. So thanks. That definitely addresses the first point I was making.
Right. And then the second point about the controllers. So at least initially, the thought was that perhaps that would be sort of like a model S2, where anything that we need that doesn't exist in Cube 113 is basically model S2, right? Again, these names are slightly, arbitrary, let's just say. But the point was that model S1 is, everything that you can do with up to and including what's already there in Cube 113, right? And anything that's not there is a sort of subsequent model. So yeah, we'll just kind of work on this somewhat in an agile manner, and then we'll see how it kind of fits into different deliverables.
Okay, thank you.
I was going to say that my comment earlier about changing the RBAC model to put the node in then is obviously not in scope for this. We're talking about CRDs and controllers and stuff.
Yeah, the new CRDs, at least at that time, was part of Model S2. But if we make rapid progress, and it has been pointed out that the upstream community is becoming more and more in favor of having more and more CRDs. So perhaps they will now be much more open to welcoming new CRDs for anything that we think is necessary. And so let's just put this stuff together and see how it lines up over the next 2 to 3 months, and then we'll kind of place it.
So my main comment would be the one-to-one tenant to namespace mapping, being that this S1 is targeting on-prem. I think a really common use case on-prem is that tenants will have like dev, test, staging, and production environments. So like some people will have separate clusters, but a lot of people will have it like a single cluster, particularly for one for non-prod and one for prod. And I think if we're going to do the taints and tolerations thing as to map the tenants to nodes, we already need some kind of CRD to store all that mapping. It doesn't seem like such a big stretch to have that mapping to multiple namespaces per tenant, as opposed to just fixing it to one. Because I think that would be a hard thing if we build all the tooling around that, it would be a hard thing to add later on.
So your point is to have multiple namespaces per tenant from day one. Is that?
Yeah, it's particularly in the on-prem model, because I think that's how a lot of people use the on-prem for their development and test environments, and the team usually kind of has more than one.
So one thing to note is our notion of a tenant, like in the example that you mentioned, dev, prod, and test, they would essentially be 3 tenants, right? So we are not Model S1 is not really modeling a service provider kind of tenancy. It is still a enterprise soft multi-tenancy kind of a model. So it would be pretty natural. This is very analogous to OpenShift projects that if you may have be familiar with OpenShift. So in OpenShift, one project equals one namespace, and you would often do a dev namespace and a testing namespace, and they would be 2 different OpenShift projects. So that's the motivation here to kind of more or less mirror.
Yeah. Okay. I understand the motivation. What that's doing though is then pushing, because what the commonality between like a particular dev test and whatever environment namespaces or tenants in this case, the commonality is probably it's the same people or groups and things in the RBAC, and you're pushing that back out to the actual tenants to have to manage all of that.
Sure. Again, we'll keep all of this sort of in our heads as we go, and then let's.
I guess from an implementation perspective, and not to get too technical, I assume from like a tenant perspective anyway, we would follow some sort of labeling of the tenant to label this namespace, or labeling of a namespace to say this is a tenant. And then, in the future, we could, add in another label of this is the tenant ID it belongs to cluster that, to make it future proof and not make it more difficult in the future. But then just stick to one for now for, I guess, ease and to quickly get started.
Right. Yeah, that's the thought, that start with one-to-one mapping, and keep the n-to-one in mind. And again, one-to-one fits naturally with RBAC as it exists today. It is also what products like OpenShift and Rancher do. So that's sort of the reason for that. We haven't, the main thing is that, again, going back to how much we want to be prescriptive about and how much we want to be non-prescriptive about is going to be, because one feedback I anticipate coming is you can't over specify this because people will want flexibility, but you don't want to under specify it, then it becomes open to interpretation.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, and the MVP is totally what we want to go for. It's just want to keep in mind that there's two halves of this. There's the implementer side, and then there's the consumer side. And the more complexity that you push to the consumer side, that would be fairly simple to incorporate. The harder it's going to be for people to take it up in the first place. It just becomes easier for people to use on day one because they don't have to build. They suddenly get something out of the box and they don't have to build extra tooling on their side just to be able to use it. So anyway, we can iterate on that.
Craig, I had a quick question just so I understand. What you're describing, you kind of have like a mixed cluster where it's both mixed tenants as well as mixed workload trust, like the pre-production, post-production. You're saying there isn't a one-to-one mapping because a particular developer could be wanting to write to two different, essentially, having two sandboxes that it would live in effectively.
Yeah, so selfishly, I shouldn't have said production because
it's an example though, but I hear that use case all the time of saying pre and post and
also we
party.
Yeah. Well, actually, our model in Commonwealth Bank is that we have much more complicated. It's not even one tenant per namespace sort of thing. You can actually mix it. If I'm actually running in my namespace one of your apps because I've got a test environment, I might want to give you access to it as well, or a different team and stuff. But that's way out of scope for this. But just the simple, in a non-prod environment, a team having multiple namespaces, like there might be a shared one that the team does like final testing and stuff. There could be CI/CD pipelines spinning up ephemeral ones, on the fly, just to do a bit of integration testing as part of a PR, validation process and stuff like that. So just the one-to-one just seems a little bit too simple to me. But that's selfish. That's just my use cases.
Yeah, we're not restricting it. It's just that we need a starting point that mirrors what people are already doing with, solutions like OpenShift. So that's what we're targeting, and that does not preclude things like, a dev tenant and a production tenant versus pre-production tenant, because these are all really not. These are more like projects as opposed to tenants. So a team could have 5 different projects on the same cluster.
Yeah, true. That's a whole other level. Yep.
Hi, this is Reza. I have a question to understand the S1 model a little bit better. So we're, for S1, we're assuming that we don't have any malicious actors, but do we offer any kind of a protection against accidental sort of errors? For example, for ingress, if you're saying that that's a shared service, well, one bad ingress object could break ingress for everyone. So so if we're going to say, well, S1 is the low-hanging fruit in soft multi-tenancy, then we should offer some protections against that. So we should offer, either multiple ingress controllers or some mechanism where the various tenants can be assured that some other tenant cannot break their ingress rules, or scheduler is shared. And could accidentally one tenant cause the scheduler to evict the pods of other tenants? So some kind of a resource management would be absolutely necessary if we're going to say this is S1, multi-tenancy model. So what kind of protections are we offering that this actually works if people adopt it?
Yeah, that's why this is called soft multi-tenancy, because there is isolation, but it is a soft isolation, right? So,
but soft isolation to me means that, okay, we don't protect against malicious actors, but if you don't protect against accidental use, then what added benefit is there?
So, firstly, it allows you to just have an infrastructure for multiple teams to work on the same cluster without stepping on each other, right? You, by having your own namespace, you're obviously totally independent in terms of your naming of your services and all that. If you happen to be on the same namespace, you can't even name your Kubernetes objects the same because they would clash, right? So you're getting some isolation. You're getting some. We are talking about having curated pod security policies and network security policies. So you will have isolation in the sense of, a malicious or even an accidental approach where one pod manages to access another pod's projects won't be possible. So there will be a level of isolation, but that's the level of isolation that, again, projects like OpenShift do. They don't do. You're not getting the kind of isolation that you get between two clouds on AWS, between two tenants of AWS, right? That we are not talking about that level of isolation. We're not talking about Coke versus Pepsi isolation. So if you look at the slides here, we've got, if Tasha, if you can go to like maybe slide 7 or, no, actually keep going down a little bit, maybe 9. So we would have, a reference profile with many of these parameters, like we've said here, curated RBAC, pod security policies, network policies, and ingress. The example that you mentioned with ingress, we need to define how much we specify that.
Some of these may be easy, like Heptia already has a fix around that ingress controller problem.
Sorry, just on that. So yeah, Contour offers a fix for that, and we're currently using it on prem, but it's probably not. You don't want to force everyone to use a particular ingress controller. I think the better way to do it is with an admission controller or something like the Open Policy Agent has a bit of sample code for an admission controller that does exactly that. It kind of manages FQDNs within ingress controllers.
Well, okay.
But I think
aside, what about quota management? What about making sure that the cluster actually doesn't over allocate?
So I was about to mention. So as soon as we start doing some of these things, it seems to me, unless we enforce external tooling, we're going to need an operator here or at least an admission controller to do some of this stuff.
Well, the whole question is the definition of S1. Wouldn't a S1, which is our base entry for soft multi-tenancy, have some optional components that allows the people who adopt it to have some protection against these shared resources like the scheduler, ingress controller? They're optional, right? But how can the base model not protect you?
So the thought is, yes, you will have the protection. Again, the thought is so far is that Model S1 is almost like a best practices document. Okay, it is literally Now, depending on how much we want to put in an operator that actually enforces this, that depends on our execution over the next few months. But at least the initial thought is that at the very least, this would be a best practices document about if you want to conform with what upstream is calling soft multi-tenancy version 1, this is what you need to do. Okay, and we are not necessarily providing an operator, but we are prescribing how you should be setting up your prod security policies, your RBAC and API server and all that. Whether we actually put a controller to enforce that depends on whether we get that done in the same time frame and other things.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think
So
quota is difficult because it's like different for everyone. Like I don't know how you would make like you can do something to address the ingress thing, but like for quota, how much quota would you give each namespace? I think that would be hard to incorporate into like a. You can say everybody should use quota, but I'm not sure you can like set the quotas in some kind of universal way that would work for everyone.
Well, I'm just wondering what would an operator say if one of their tenants caused the other tenants' workloads to get evicted and cause disruption to them? How would they respond to that tenant's complaint then? And then if there is no response, then is this S1 a minimum viable product, right? So will anybody use it if one tenant can cause other tenants' workloads to get evicted? Right.
Well, so are you concerned about preemption? So the quota you can set per priority level, and you can avoid the preemption that you're talking about. I don't know if that's what you're referring to, but I don't know how we can set quotas in something that applies to everyone. We can tell people to use quotas and to set per priority quota, which is a feature that's already in Kubernetes, to prevent the wrong people from preempting the wrong people's pods. But like, I don't know how you can formalize that in something that's automated, because everybody's quotas are going to.
Well, let me state my question differently. Is Model S1 viable if the adopters cannot make sure that one tenant's workload will not preempt other tenants' workload with proper precaution, right? So, I mean, should that be
I think S1 is viable if it doesn't have that, if that isn't a requirement for the given use case. I agree that that's probably a pretty like perhaps likely use case or valuable use case to be solved, but it's possible that in certain soft multi-tenancy situations, the distributor of the software might not have this problem because they control all of the software that's being ran. They just want to use tenancy for some isolation, but they're not really worried about certain workloads bouncing either, or they've written anti-affinity policies to make sure that that's not the case or something,
Yeah, I think the discussion is around what is the actual MVP scope here and how much do we want to take on.
So the goal is, firstly, this is literally however much we can. So the goal is to firstly, have a reasonable level of solutions available for soft multi-tenancy by the time of KubeCon Europe in May, end of May, right? And really, with this model, we're talking about whatever you can do with Cube 113, right, which is the latest cube that is out. And then depending on how we end up adding new objects after Cube 113, that will be a next phase of soft multi-tenancy. And, that may end up being post KubeCon and so on. So, new controllers and so on. So I know I'm being a little bit open-ended here because this is a very broad topic here. And in order to keep it going, we want to get some simple quick wins, right? So a simple quick win is a documented best practice along with some test automation saying, if you follow this best practice, you will get a reasonable soft multi-tenancy today, And we are in the process of developing controllers for it and adding it to upstream, which will be available in maybe Cube 114, 115, 116, depends on how we end up making progress.
I think,
And yeah.
sorry. If I could just add, I guess, I think something that we should potentially add to this best practice to kind of qualm some of these questions is, and these are, some common use cases or just some examples of what this can and can't do. It just to, to make it clear that, yeah, there are some holes in this, but if this is what you're looking to do, you can accomplish it with this model.
Well, so my okay. So I see sort of a conflict in here that I think it's perfectly fine to target a date for a particular release, but then if you're going to name something and call it a model S1, it needs to be complete and a minimum viable product. So to say that model S1 is got a target release date, that's what we have to trim down its requirements. I don't think that should be a named release.
True, right. Okay, that was in a manner of speaking, but really what Model S1 is really trying to do is more or less match proprietary solutions like OpenShift projects. That's really what it is, okay? With or without a controller. The controller part depends on whether we get it done in time, right? So Model S1 is trying to mirror in upstream what vendor solutions like OpenShift are doing. That's really the emphasis of Model S1, okay? That timeline was just sort of our own little checklist of when we want to get this thing done. We don't want to drag this out too far out, right?
So I think there's a danger here in setting our baseline, because like the real thing is that OpenShift really do all of that lower level hard controls around stuff. We're kind of picking an arbitrary subset of what OpenShift and people do and saying that's our MVP. I think maybe we need to decide our own MVP.
Yes, the OpenShift is just one reference point. It's the closest reference point that one can provide, and we would definitely welcome folks from Red Hat coming in so that we can exactly line this up with OpenShift. But that's sort of
so I'm not an expert on OpenShift, but like I think I'm a little confused here because OpenShift, as I understand it, I understand the project stuff, but like in general, OpenShift has various features for multi-tenancy and isolation. Most of them are just the same as the upstream features, and then they have some small number of unique features, as I understand it. But all of these things are like, if you use it, then you can get certain enhanced isolation, and if you don't use it, then you don't. And so it seems like whether it's OpenShift or upstream Kubernetes, these all have the same flavor, like quotas. If you use them, then you can prevent someone from using all the resources in the cluster, and if you don't, then you won't. And I would assume that the OpenShift features are the same way. And so I don't know that this is like weaker than OpenShift per se, in the sense that like OpenShift probably makes features available that you can use or not use, and then likewise upstream does the same thing. I don't know if that makes sense, but like it's not like, as I understand it, it's not like OpenShift out of the box does X, Y, and Z. It does certain things, but I'm not sure how much more it does than off-the-shelf Kubernetes. And then if you want something with stronger isolation, you have to configure it that way.
Yeah, and the question is, if I, as an operator, adopt this Model S1, okay, is it going to work for me? And if you sort of don't have enough specification in there for me to basically make sure that it works for me, then what have you accomplished?
Yeah, so Reza, the target for Model S1 is an enterprise operator that wants to provide service to n number of teams sharing a cluster, right? Which is exactly the use case of OpenShift also, as FYI. If you have a specific metric that is of interest to you, please define it. Your metric could be, I want ingress to be isolated in such a manner. So if you can give us a specific set of metrics that you would like to cross-check against each model, we would be happy to do that. But otherwise, it's an open-ended question, because you ask the same question to OpenShift, they'll give you the same answer. Well, it's a soft multi-tenancy, depends on what features you turn on, you might get some isolation. So this is exactly in the same line as David was saying. But if you have a specific set of metrics that are of importance to you, please list those out.
Yeah, I mean, the two that I mentioned are kind of important to me. If we're going to use Ingress, then, we have to be able to protect the different tenants from accidental use. And then also the scheduler. Scheduler is shared resource, and whatever we can give the operator to do quota management, QoS, so that one tenant cannot, sort of like noisy neighbor problem in the cluster. Right.
So I think that those are listed under tenant namespace setup on this slide with curated tenant resource quota and then curated Kubernetes ingress and service model. So it seems like we at least have the right set of features listed here to answer what you're looking for. And then as we progress and start building out the recommendations, you should definitely take a look at those and make sure that they're going in the direction that you would need them to, and then offer feedback there.
All right, thanks.
Right, and please be as specific as you need to be. Like you could say that, it must, it needs to be more specific than saying ingress isolation. It needs to be a very precise definition of isolation. Otherwise, it's a little bit of, there's some amount of ambiguity that comes in. So yeah, as Tasha said, that these are all metrics that are on the table. But if you have a precise definition of isolation, then feel free to provide that so that we can cross-check against whatever we do.
Thank you.
I just want to throw in again, some of these things, if there's a one-to-one between tenants and namespaces, you do almost get out of the box, and it only becomes tricky if for example, the tenant quotas is across 5 or 6 namespaces, things like that. That's when you need to do something.
Yeah, again, here we're talking about quotas per namespace. So if you are a tenant that owns 5 namespaces, you have a quota in each of those 5. We're not talking about multi-namespace quotas. Again, we'll just using standard Kubernetes here. Model S1 is all about just providing a reference and best practice and automation around existing Kubernetes constructs. We're not defining anything other than possibly some controllers. But we're just providing a reference model so that when 2 people define a multi-tenant cluster, they can look at this document and they can both get similar behavior.
Yeah. So I think maybe to Rez's, the thing, being S1, it's soft, and it's actually very soft, and that trying to get full fairness in the control plane and the full isolation model is more like a further model like S2 or I can't remember, H1 or whatever it was. H1 was really super duper hard, but yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I think as we look at what S1 is and we see the gaps, it'll be a really good opportunity for us to write down all of those gaps and then use those to inform how we improve for both S2 and H1. Because, everything that's coming up right now is actually super valuable just for saying, what can we achieve today? And if it's not on the list, but it's something we all agree is important, just making sure that we're tracking to that as we kind of pick up the next set of work.
So is there still any, so out of Sanjeev's excellent document, we seem to be arguing over a couple of bullet points on one slide. Is there anything else that we need to resolve?
So how much do people care about shared services? Like a shared monitoring service that needs to be consumed by n different tenants? Is it important?
Very.
Very important.
For our use cases, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, same.
Okay, because some of these may involve us working with some other projects like Prometheus. Prometheus has a multi-tenant version just coming out. There's a new project called Cortex. So we may have to look at that. But again, we don't want to boil the ocean. We want to have simple, quick wins and iterate so that we have something to show and then we can keep enhancing it over time.
Yeah, I think the ability to have shared services is kind of a baseline, because otherwise you just need to duplicate lots of stuff. But I think getting into the specifics of exactly which shared services are mandatory is not in scope, I don't think.
True. I think monitoring would be one canonical, not a handy common example, but we wouldn't be trying to model every that would be a reference for any other kind of future shared service which end tenants need to share.
I just spotted something that I think is probably worth more discussion. The common but minimally dependent network storage and cloud provider plugins. That one I think could be unpacked a bit, because that's, if we start mandating some of those things, or there's enough differences between things, like, so we're in the situation right now because we have bare metal and VMware, and trying to come up with a storage model that is kind of a bit transparent to our consumers across different things is actually turns out to be non-trivial. Do we want to make is that something that we should have in scope for this?
Could you elaborate whether what you're saying is that specific to the provider of the storage, or?
Well, I'm not quite sure what that bullet point means. If we're saying, like, so Calico, so we use Calico.
Okay. Okay, you're talking about the bottom left bullet. Okay, I see.
Yeah, sorry, yes. So there's Calico. There's the network policy providers. There's Calico. There's not just one Calico now. There's a couple of different ones, and AWS have their own flavor. Then we've been engaging with Tigera because we have a lot of Windows stuff, so they're actually building a Windows version which is sort of the same. And then when you get down to storage and stuff, it's different enough across cloud providers. It just seems like that's a thorny problem to put into our MVP for this. I know it's valid, but are we putting too many things on the plate?
So my thought when I put that bullet was, at any point where we have to make a recommendation that could vary from one network plugin to another, we want to use a lowest common denominator or a relatively common network plugin. So for example, Calico would be a relatively common network plugin, and vSphere would be a relatively common on-prem provider. So the thought was that if any of this becomes dependent on the kind of provider, then maybe Calico and vSphere would be the ones to pick because they're relatively common.
Okay. Yeah, that's starting to seem awfully prescriptive because it's not part of Kate's. It's additional external third-party provided things.
Right. Yeah, we'll have to balance not sounding overly prescriptive. It was just sort of like for example, right? We were talking about having network policy that can isolate namespaces and also be available for apps.
Yeah,
now,
I think the alternative is to define the features that those plugins should have, as opposed to naming a product.
Mm-hmm.
Which will probably end up being Calico in the end anyway, because it's taking over the world. But and we love it. But there's other people who really do want to use Flannel for various reasons, and there's other things like NSXT and stuff that people want to use, and then there's Istio over the top of that, and it all gets a bit murky.
I think it's a good idea to keep it to what features and capabilities we're looking for rather than pin it too tightly to a single provider.
True. Yeah, that bullet was just a placeholder in case we run into something that does depend on the provider. Perhaps these two would be a reference we would pick without being prescriptive. But I think we all agree that we do not want to make it specific to any vendor or any provider.
Yeah. So, for example, Calico. Yeah.
Right.
Cool. Well, we're running out of time for today. Did anyone want to say anything to wrap up? Okay. Well, thanks everyone. This was a super useful conversation. Definitely a lot to sort of iterate on. Again, if you want to put anything into this document, we're going to definitely be leveraging this and all of the comments within it to get to that more formalized diagram and architecture that we'll be working on, which we'll then share with this group and open up for another round of conversation and comment, or several rounds. So yeah, throw in all of your thoughts into the doc, and we will plan on our next meeting to have a first pass at a more formalized document based on all of this conversation that we can share with everybody. Cool, thanks so much.
Awesome. Thank you.